Why limlim slacht? Hulagakus kitchen tum tagai Hanslacht, dat is kweltem dan away. Kins gemeente. Lutswittig is gaelsentum. Kim gastig is koolstem dan away. Wat happen na? Klein chow, klein pupatuinau, klein chichmalas. Kliayat kuis kaustum dan away. Chmatwai he switched he tiechted, he has to wilted, he marimsens, he switched he shilk. Katlincha, within Pupatuinau. Liayat is naksil. Limlim. Tell you, my friend, I'm glad that your friends got here. And I don't want you to be angry that anyone continue to do what you're doing. Hopefully, people will listen. That you are giving medicine back to the salmon, back to the water, to all of my relation. Thank you, my friend. And that's what I would say to Chris.
A century and a half ago, Thomas Jefferson envisioned an empire of freedom and opportunity in the far Northwest. His bold determination sent Lewis and Clark westward through the wilderness, down the course of America's greatest power stream.
There's a great and peaceful river in a land that's fair to see, where the Douglas fir tree whispers to the snow-capped mountain breeze, where the cliffs are solid granite and the valley is always green. This is just as close to heaven as my traveling feet have been.
More than a century after Lewis and Clark reached the Columbia, thousands of Dust Bowl refugees made a journey of their own to the great river of the West. The migrants found work constructing Grand Coulee Dam and later farming the desert of eastern Washington with the irrigation water the dam would provide.
The rapids and the falls, the big Grand Coulee Dam in the state of Washington is just about the biggest thing that man has ever done. During
World War II, aluminum for the war effort was produced using electricity generated by Grand Coulee's hydroelectric turbines. After the war ended, government agencies produced propaganda films to gain public support for the construction of additional dams.
The biggest thing that man had ever done.
The Columbia has been a wild and uncontrolled giant. 30 million horsepower wasting to the sea. A tremendous force for good or for evil. So the mighty Columbia flings a challenge to a nation. 10 million horsepower of new energy, endless water power to meet the grave electric shortage. Conserve our vital oil supply. Provide water power for the mighty dams that must be built. That is the challenge of the Columbia.
Hello, this is Christopher.
Hi, it's NPR calling.
Hey, how you doing?
Hi, good. Hold on, we'll patch you in.
Okay.
This is Talk of the Nation. I'm Neil Conan in Washington. And now to ask one final time why some people do crazy things. Tomorrow, June 4th, in Canal Flats, British Columbia, Christopher Swain will dive into the glacial headwaters of the Columbia River and begin a 6-month swim designed, in his words, to make the Columbia fishable, swimmable, and drinkable for future generations. In a historic first, Swain will swim all 1,243 miles of the Columbia River from the headwaters all the way down to the Pacific. And Christopher Swain joins us now from Columbia Lake in British Columbia, and welcome to Talk of the Nation.
Thank you, Neil.
What do you do to prepare for something like this?
Well, I think first you've got to fall in love with a cold, contaminated river, and then you just see where that leads you. But I suppose on the training side, you got to train your body, of course. You got to lift the weights. You got to swim the meters. You got to run the hills. But mostly you've got to get your mind ready, because there are going to be days when it's so cold and you're so far from even a road that you need to remember why you got started.
Cold, I'm willing to believe, contaminated even at the headwaters of the Columbia?
Actually, the headwaters are, in the most charming way possible, almost pure. Tomorrow morning when I dive in, there'll be 100 local elementary school children. They're actually going to toast me with goblets of Columbia Lake water, which is perfectly drinkable at the source there at the springs. And my hope for the swim is that this catalyzes an effort that results in that being true every step of the way in every settlement all the way down the river someday.
Now, between you and the Pacific, I think our research indicates 14 dams.
Which means 13 overheated lakes of slack water that I have to slog through. 150 miles just behind Grand Coulee alone. And that's why I run the hills, because it's going to be the 10th day of that's going to make me question this whole idea.
Columbia River is a pretty daunting prospect. Have you tried any other rivers out just to warm up?
I did swim the Connecticut River in 1996 for Universal Human Rights, and while that wasn't on the scale of the Columbia in terms of, a big, bad, raging river, it still prepared me for the rhythm of it, the 12-mile days, the thousands and thousands of strokes, the 10,000 calories a day, eating every 15 minutes and drinking from the boat, that kind of thing. So I have the rhythm of it in me, but nothing as big as the Columbia in my history. But then again, no one's ever swum the Columbia.
And you've talked about your environmental goals for it, but this has got to be a personal challenge as well.
Yeah, I think I'm walking an interesting line here. In some sense, I'm trying to sort out why I felt called to swim the Columbia. I'm curious to see what I'll find and where that'll lead me on a personal level. And I'm certainly challenged to balance being a dad and being a husband during the process. But I think most of all on the personal level, I see an opportunity here to both answer a call, but to try to do the right thing. I believe that if I get into that river, I can put the river in the public eye. I can highlight threats and solutions, and folks who might not know that most contaminated of beauties, the Columbia, is slipping away, might get the word, and who knows, they might come to her aid.
Christopher Swain, the best of luck to you.
Oh, thank you, Neil, and I invite you to come paddle along with me.
Maybe just for a mile or two. Christopher Swain will tomorrow jump into the Columbia River and swim from the source all the way to the Pacific. In Washington, I'm Neil Conan, NPR News.
The first stretch of the Columbia River is quite magnificent. It's between two spines of mountains that drain alluvially into the bottom of a lake, and it comes up as springs through the bottom of the lake. You have intensely cold water, very shallow water in an all-gravel lake bottom, and that's where the river starts. The day we departed, I was there early. I had to put the boat in and put safety gear in the boat and make arrangements with news crews for pickup and drop off and make sure they got the footage they needed. Before you know it, there were hundreds of people there at the park, the regional park where we started at the headwaters. And it was just a groundswell of people just showing up. After some speechifying, Christopher got into the water, and we basically began to wing it. There was a lot of experimentation to see what the best rhythm would be, how we would work together, how we would sort of psychologically tether with one another and time things out during the course of the day. We got to try out more things the second day, and by the third day we were pretty much in a rhythm. We knew about feeding times and proximities, where we needed to be close to each other or not, what types of foods he would want at what time, what kind of information he needed on distance covered, all of these little things that we attended to make sure that he was psychologically comfortable in the water as well as physically comfortable in the water. In between Canal Flats and Golden is a labyrinth of sloughs, quite extraordinary, teeming with wildlife, beautiful rising slopes and forests on either side, agricultural valleys, all the way up toward Golden. The diversity and volume of wildlife is overwhelming. It was more than I saw at any point later in the swim. Every type of North American Rocky Mountain avian species you could imagine, we saw it.
This is one of the most marvelous places in the world. I know it's unique in all of North America, that it's the longest continuous undeveloped wetlands remaining. Wetlands act as carbon sinks to help with atmospheric balance. They're marvelous filters. They're flood control. They help to replenish water tables. Plus, look at it. What a neat place. How can you beat that? What we have here is a lot of people escaping from the bigger cities. Like our nearest big city topped 1 million population this summer, and so this is a big draw. And the people are welcome. They want to live here. Well, that's fine. But I think most people come for it being the way it is. But they in a lot of cases they come in such numbers that after a while it's not the way it was. Why they came here to start with. It's too big now. When you want sidewalks and streetlights and fire hydrants and to be able to call for pizzas at 2 a.m., something's got to give, and it's usually the environment.
We could see in our mind's eye that what was visiting these areas, this burst of development and this economic opportunity that was occurring along with this type of tourism, was sort of the first step to the degradation of the river. We could see where the river was suffering in some of these areas where wetlands had been filled, there wasn't adequate sewage treatment, and we could see some real changes in the river in these areas.
As a Canadian, I can recite that the Columbia is 1,947 kilometers long, right? That it falls 877 meters, and it has a discharge of 197 billion cubic meters, and that it drains 671,000 square kilometers. I can tell you that. But that means nothing compared to the simplicity of experiencing it. For me, personally, this is a gift. This is Eden, or whatever your personal belief.
In a direct line, we went 8.57 miles today. We've done a total of 33.5 miles in 4 days.
As the crow flies.
As the crow flies. This is all straight line computation. He's probably swum 50 miles because of the 2 sloughs we passed through. So, long, cold days. These first 4 days were long and arduous, and we're going to have to cut our hours back just to take care of the tasks and to make sure that we get enough sleep. We're going to be out here 6 months, and we want to look after our health. It's important.
pre-construction of the Grand Coulee Dam in around the early 1930s, we had anadromous salmon coming up from the Pacific Ocean to spawn all the way in this area right here. And they weren't just salmon runs, they were massive. They were equivalent to anything you'd see on the coast. Now, why is that important? It is a huge ecosystem function. These salmon go out into the ocean, they harvest all of this nutrients from the ocean, and then they bring it back to the interior. And when they come up here and they die, what it does is just launches this whole ecosystem function where the bears and the raptors and the wildlife, they start feeding on the salmon that start coming up. And based upon that, there's a whole level of life that depended upon that ecosystem function.
Wild salmon are born in freshwater streams and rivers. Young salmon remain in their birthing waters for several months before making their way to the ocean, where they will spend their adult lives. Once salmon have reached breeding age, they swim back to the exact location of their birth, where they breed and die. The journey home can be thousands of miles long.
Wild salmon today are somewhere between 1% and 5% of what they used to be historically. They're hanging on in some areas. We've completely eliminated them in others. In the Columbia Basin, the largest problem facing the salmon is overdevelopment of the hydro system. Now, we've seen places where salmon and dams can coexist. Salmon can survive and thrive. But we also know that we went too far in some places.
Young salmon evolved with fast-flowing waters carrying them to the sea. A dammed river creates a series of fake lakes, and for a small fish, that can be disastrous. Predators have learned to take advantage of the slow-moving, tired juveniles. The reservoirs also store solar energy, which heats the water to lethal levels for young fish. Many of those that survive the reservoirs will then be killed as they pass through the dam's hydroelectric turbines. Juvenile bypass systems can help reduce the number of young salmon killed in the turbines. Fish ladders can be an effective way to get adult salmon over the dams, but most dams, including 5 on the Columbia, don't have fish ladders or juvenile bypass systems. The first barrier to fish passage that Christopher encountered was Mica Dam. Mica, Revelstoke, and Hugh Keenlyside dams are operated in conjunction with the terms of the Columbia River Treaty. The treaty was signed in 1964 and allows the United States to tap into Che Wana's massive hydroelectric potential in Canada. The building of the dams was controversial and angered many of those whose homes and livelihoods were put underwater.
I don't feel good about it because they ruined a lot of good livelihood for the people that could have used it. We all could have used it. Now, if there was other source of power for them, I wish they'd have took that opportunity instead of all this over here.
We had people that were displaced in this region, thousands of people that were displaced from their communities and moved. We had wildlife habitat areas, wetland, low elevation, winter range habitats that were flooded, and those habitats are now underwater. We had the economic opportunities for the people who were impacted. Low elevation lands are the most economically viable lands for farming, for forestry, for all of those types of economic activities that were really the heart of our region, and those areas were lost.
I'm not too happy about it in a way because here we're holding the bag is what we're doing.
The Columbia River Treaty is up for renewal in 2024, with negotiations set to begin in 2014. Many communities along the river in Canada see the upcoming negotiations as an opportunity.
We feel that coming into 2024, when there's an opportunity to terminate, renew, or renegotiate the treaty, that there's an opportunity for a number of groups and a number of values to be put forward on the table.
I'm 34 years old, and when I was 4 years old, there was a law passed in the United States called the Clean Water Act. And what the law said was very simple. It said every single waterway, every river, lake, everything except a pothole in the road, basically, in the United States belongs to the people of the United States. It also said that the rivers and the waterways had to be clean. They had to be cleaned up. They had to be clean enough to drink, to fish in, and to swim. So it's been 30 years since that law, almost my whole life. And Is the Columbia River clean enough for me to swim and drink and fish? No. So I've had it. I'm tired of waiting. I'm like a kid who's had his bicycle broken when he's 4 years old, and 30 years later no one's fixed it. So I'm going to fix it myself. That's my idea. And one of the things I'm going to do is not just swim the river, but actually come back. So I'm hoping to come see you guys again this winter and tell you what it was like. And I'll tell you the bad stuff that I saw, things that are hurting the river, and I'll tell you the ideas that I've had and the things that I've learned that people are doing that will help. And then maybe we can do something together.
Before Christopher left Canadian waters, he swam past the Teck Cominco metal smelter and its mountain of slag. Christopher would see this slag in the river and on her shores for miles after the international border. Once his belongings were cleared by Customs Inspector Hopkins, Christopher swam into the United States and the historic territory of the noisy water people.
I got to see the river when it was a river. My grandfather, and his name was Ksusus, he took me and stood me alongside the river, and his heart was full of love, telling me, he said, "This is what I have to offer you, my son." He was so proud that river was plentiful, full of food, and he was so proud to offer that to me. And now I take my little 4-year-old and I'm so ashamed that I or my wife, we don't have nothing to offer. It's gone.
Before Grand Coulee Dam was built, each member of the Colville tribe ate on average about 1 1/4 pounds of salmon a day, according to Vern Ray, an anthropologist who lived among the Colvilles in the 1920s. The most sacred ceremonies of Colville religious life, along with the most intensive seasons of work and feasting, revolved around the summer salmon harvest. When the dam was finished and the upstream became a 150-mile-long lake, Kittle Falls disappeared, along with all the salmon. On the reservation, rates of suicide, fatal car accidents, alcoholism, drug addiction, divorce, and death by house fire soared to levels that stunned the anthropologist who had been living with the Colvilles before the building of the dam. Ray wrote that Grand Coulee Dam was built with a ruthless disregard for Indians as human beings, creating a dammed-up river that drowned the culture it had nourished. The dam flooded more than 21,000 acres of prime bottomland, where Indians had been living for perhaps as long as 10,000 years. In addition to Kittle Falls, the best hunting, farming, and root-gathering land disappeared. So did most tribal burial grounds. None of the irrigation water diverted from the river by Grand Coulee Dam has ever been made available to the Indians. All of the water goes to the non-reservation side of the Columbia. While the tribes await the return of Kittle Falls, they are working to get fish ladders and juvenile bypass systems built into Grand Coulee and Chief Joseph dams. They're also dealing with pollution from Canadian industries that has made its way across the international border.
The Cominco plant basically for over 100 years have been violating the Boundary Waters Treaty. They've been polluting our river, and they've dumped millions of tons of slag into the river.
Slag's a byproduct of the smelting at the Cominco mine in Canada. The water carries it down and displaces it in wherever the water kind of slows down in the bends and stuff. It kind of disperses that stuff there.
This is known as the Black Sands Beach, and as you can see, it is black, and It is made up of slag from the smelter, and because this is an eddy here, a lot of it tends to be dumped right here. And they've been doing it since the beginning of the 20th century, and they just stopped in 1995. There's glass particles in here. Cominco claimed initially that it was inert, but subsequent studies have found out that it is not inert, and it is damaging to the organisms that feed on that the fish feed on, and it's not good stuff.
The Celgar pulp mill used a chlorine bleach process for about 35 years, and their untreated waste went directly into the river. Since then, they've renovated their plant, and they're operating much better. Both of those Canadian industries have used the Columbia River as a sewer for their industrial waste.
The dam is operated in such a way where they'll draw that down to a certain level in the spring, depending on the snowpack, to control flooding in the lower reaches. So that opens up miles and miles of the sandy beaches, dries out, and we get these big dust events that you get these big dust clouds where you can't even see across the river.
We know now that the bed sediments have high levels of metals. When those become airborne in this dust, we're breathing those in on a daily basis. What's happening? What's happening with our river? We want to understand it. We're not trying to scare people away from our beautiful river. It's a treasure. And for those of us who live here, we want a better river. We want it taken care of, and we want to be able to take care of it.
I grew up on the river. As kids, from the time far back as I can remember, we've went down to the river. We've fished, we've played on the beaches, and for years we didn't know, or I didn't know anything was wrong with the river. To us, it was just someplace to go play. So when I'm talked about in 20, 30 years, I want to be a part of something good that's happened on the river, because for 100 years there's really been nothing done about it. I take it very personally, and the tribes takes it very personally, and again, we're not going anywhere. We're going to be here till something happens, and happens good.
I met Christopher at one of the public meetings that EPA held at Kettle Falls, and I knew that he was swimming the river, and I was looking forward to meeting him. Swimming the river during my life, I know how cold the river is, so I've just been very impressed by his desire, his dream.
What you feel inside is what you get, whether it's good or bad. If you feel pride, you must be doing right and should be glad. Directions, no, directions show you where you ought to be. Follow your heart, don't fall apart, and that's when you will see. Create a way, don't look away, don't look away, hey. Create a way, don't look away, don't look away, hey. Create a way, don't look away, don't look away, hey. Create a way, don't look away, don't look away, hey.
The salmon now only go as far as Chief Joe, and then there's no way around for them to get up any further. A long time ago, when the salmon would run up, the Wenatchee band, they would practically starve themselves because they would want to make sure that enough salmon got up for the rest of the people.
Yeah, he'll swim for about 15 to 20. He'll come in to get hot tea and any food he wants, and he'll do that until he gets to about 3,500 strokes today, and then he'll come in for lunchtime and usually gets out of his gear. We'll get him some more hot water, and he'll hang out for an hour or so, and then we'll get back in.
Oh, here it comes!
I never really got how he could swim in that cold water. That was always kind of amazing to me. He was just kind of born with that capability. I don't think it's something you learn or can practice. Like, I don't think you sit in a bathtub with ice cubes and, you know, hey, look, I'm practicing for swimming the Columbia in the winter. Tom Louie up on the Colville Reservation got us a houseboat. I guess the tribes own a lot of boats up there. We'd always heat up some water to pour into his wetsuit, kind of give him a little warm start, which, you know, 2 minutes later was probably back to the 39 degrees. Our daily ritual would be Swain would get in the water, swim for a while till his face and hands got really numb so he couldn't form words. Then he would get out, we'd cook up some sort of grilled cheese or some equally hot and greasy, nasty lunch. The houseboat was nice. I guess some of them had hot tubs. Somehow we didn't get the one with the hot tub.
3 months after Christopher dove into Columbia Lake, Rick got sick and had to leave the swim. Rick's replacement as crew chief was Chris Runyard, a commercial airline pilot and river restoration activist. As a former fighter pilot, Chris flew Iraq's no-fly zones in the 90s and later trained in the skies above Oregon and Washington. From the cockpit of his A6 Intruder, Chris gained a unique and disturbing perspective of the forests of the Pacific Northwest.
There's parts of the Oregon forest that is logged both sides of the hills down to the ravine into the creek, both sides for miles. And there's no way that can't affect the salmon. I didn't know that much about anything then. I just saw what I saw. And as I started paying a little more attention to it, I started hearing about the plight of the salmon, started reading a little bit about the dams, what they do or don't do to the fish. Kind of put everything together, and I don't know, just had a little change of heart.
Despite contributions from local businesses and donations Christopher received during outreach events, he was not able to generate the financial support necessary to finish the swim without interruption. 2 weeks after reaching the halfway point on the river, Christopher had to take several weeks off from the swim to earn money.
Now we find out about this wheelbarrow.
We're talking about some guys who swam the Grand Canyon and the Colorado, and that thing's got a current. he's swimming face first. They were swimming feet first. So he's swimming a lake. It is just outrageous that he's doing something like this. And it makes you think of the whole river, not just the stretch that we in Portland know so much. It's just like the gorge and maybe up to the Dalles.
I want to see him in action. I want to see him in the river. So I'm tempted to actually volunteer, get involved.
Money was a stressor, terribly underfunded. He had to come back and work odd jobs and try and make it work. I think it was hard on his family, being gone that much and not having a lot of money. I think there's a lot of stress with that.
How you doing, bro? Is that you on the phone? No. Bye-bye, bro. Bye. Would you like a pet, a little hug? Over here. Oh, okay.
Okay, you'll see Daddy, and we'll see Nana. out to the ocean.
Let's go swim.
Okay. Bye, Roro.
Hold you till your dreams run free. To and fro, weathering old winter to spring. Tethers untying, moonshine on the river. I'll rock you through anything, so sleep, baby, sleep.
Having found the atomic bomb, we have used it. It is an awful responsibility which has come to us. We thank God that it has come to us instead of to our enemies. And we pray that he may guide us to use it in his ways and for his purposes.
Well, Hanford's a mess.
You know, if we don't clean up Hanford and get all of this stuff out of the ground, you will have, within 100 years, 100% chance of getting cancer by being along the river near Hanford.
They provided mass public deception for many years that says, don't worry, everything's fine.
When you consider that if we fail to clean it up, if we leave it as it is now, things just get worse. And you're dealing with half-lives of the major isotopes, something around the range of 250,000 year half-life. So there's potential here to just kill a river. Well, there's a piece of land that the Columbia River flows right through in southeastern Washington that in 1943 was fenced off by the U.S. Army so that they could do nuclear weapons production, essentially, refine plutonium.
The Manhattan Project was moved here to Hanford because of the abundance of clear, clean water that they needed to cool the reactors, the abundance of cheap electricity provided by Grand Coulee Dam and Bonneville Dam. It is a isolated wasteland, quote unquote, and the people were expendable.
You know, this is a section of river with plutonium, uranium, iodine-129, strontium-90 in it, tritium in it, just according to the Department of Energy. This is an area where, on both sides of the river, they don't even know where all the waste even is, because the waste was dumped in open trenches and sometimes just straight on the ground or buried. And for a long time, for many years, decades, nobody kept track of where that happened.
Hanford has about 580 square miles, and a good bit of that is exposure along the Columbia River. When the site was created in the early 1940s, they set up a system that created the nuclear fuel in the 300 area, which is close to the city of Richland, and then it created 9 plutonium reactors, and they're sitting up the river at different places along the river. My responsibility is to take that nuclear fuel production facility, all of those reactors, and then all of the waste sites that are associated with that activity, and clean it up to the eventual land use, depending on where they are.
The Columbia River has been contaminated by Hanford. In fact, in the 1980s, the Columbia River was considered one of the most radioactive rivers in the world.
A lot of material went into the river years past. Millions and millions of curies of material. Some of the stuff is still going into the river. Strontium, cesium, thorium, which is a very bad actor on any type of life. Chromium. Chromium is used to keep the pipes clean, and there are miles and miles and miles of pipe underneath those tanks and throughout the whole system that they're proposing just to walk away from. In 1989 and 1991, 101 SY almost exploded. The hydrogen and hydrogen oxide was building up in there and pushing this crust to the top.
every 120 days, and when it couldn't go any further, then it would spew out the relief valves. And what was going into the air, no one knew. They still haven't characterized what's in all of those tanks. Scientists went through the worst case scenario. Supposing there was a 7.0 earthquake. And of course you'd knock out all the power there, you would knock out everything, you wouldn't have any water, those basins crack open, that material that would run down into the river would probably kill a large majority of the marine life there, and Richland takes its drinking water out of the river system, purifies it supposedly. But more importantly, without any water on these fuel rods, they become pyrophoric. They will burn. The scenario said that within 23 hours, a meltdown would take place. The small, thin, rather, steel buildings would collapse, and you would have a China syndrome. And dependent upon the atmospheric conditions, wherever the stuff went, people would die. People are so used to making a lot of money down here. I think, in my personal opinion, some people don't want to clean it up. They got a golden goose here that keeps laying a golden egg, and they're making a lot of money.
Now what you've got, of course, is an interesting little thing. You've got what's essentially become a wildlife refuge because of the fence line. You've got this somewhat intact shrub steppe ecosystem. Some would say the largest chunk that's still intact in Washington state. You've also got a section of river, it's 52 miles or so, that's relatively free-flowing. And everything that brings, which is of course an explosion of wildlife. And you've got some of the most contaminated chunks of land in the Western Hemisphere right there.
Well, about Hanford, I mean, when you're by canoe and you've been through lock after lock and dam after dam, all those PUD dams up by Wenatchee, and then all of a sudden you come to Hanford, which is 47 miles of free-flowing, great big river by canoe, and I would think for Christopher too, it's a sensational change. It's a one-day, 47-mile shot because you can't camp on the nuclear reservation. If I could package one day of the river and give it to a friend, give it to somebody I love, it would be that one day on the Hanford Reach where the river just picks up a canoe and goes with it.
Maybe in brief, an interesting thing to say would be one of the last free-flowing sections of the Columbia River happens to run through one of the most contaminated spots in the Western Hemisphere. All the wildlife that's attendant to a free-flowing section is there. You know, the elk, the wild horses even, the white pelicans are all in evidence immediately. Every kind of waterfowl. For the swimmer looking down through his goggles, it's hundreds of acres of gravel beds for miles and miles and miles and miles and miles. So prime salmon spawning habitat. And the irony of the thing, you know, isn't lost on almost anyone after a trip through the Reach, which is wow, this is one of the greatest chunks of habitat on the whole river that you can still see. And it's absolutely contaminated beyond almost all understanding.
Yeah, I'm a little scared, but in my mind I know it's not going to amount to much, and all that flow will protect me, and it'll be a fast trip through there, hopefully. I still can't believe they dumped hundreds of millions of gallons of the hottest stuff we've ever made onto the ground. And it's hard to deal with the fact that it's hit the groundwater and that there's a strontium-90 plume and an iodine-129 plume that have hit the river, and, you know, a million other things kind of run through my mind. It is the most contaminated spot on the continent. Sometimes when I say that to people, I don't think they get it. And if you live in Portland, why you should care is you're downstream. You know, every day End Springs is drip, drip, dripping into your river. And sure, there's a ton of flow. But what nobody knows and what nobody studies is what happens when you live there your whole life. What happens when you, if you live in Richland, drink that water every day. And what happens if you live downwind? You know, I mean, Department of Energy refuses to do a study that goes beyond the fence line. And that seems kind of crazy to me. But I'm not a scientist, so
Maybe it's just me that thinks that the radioactivity doesn't know there's a fence there.
And I think that we all in the country have to stick together and say, no, we want a thorough cleanup, and it's worth the money. Right now, the whole thing is it's not worth the money. You know, we have better things to spend it on, like war and making more weapons, but we can't clean up the messes that we've already made.
"10 months and 900 miles into the swim, Christopher reached the confluence of the Snake River. 200 years ago, Meriwether Lewis wrote that the water here was 50 feet deep and clear at every depth. The number and size of the salmon in the area astounded him.
When Lewis and Clark stumbled out of the Bitterroots in September of 1805, and they stumbled into the welcoming hands of the Nez Perce tribe, they were fed salmon and camas root. That's what kept them alive. And those salmon today are at risk of extinction.
Extinction's really serious. The more you do it, the dicier the ecosystem gets, the food web, because you can only take out so many species and have the web still work. We don't know how many. We never will until it crashes. Hopefully we don't get to that point, but we're headed there.
Portland biologist Leslie Sharp spent several years studying Baiji dolphins on the Yangtze River in China. Human activities on the Yangtze have been degrading the river and killing off the Baiji for decades.
I had a chance to really see the diminishing population and what extinction really means, because I saw dolphin in the Yangtze River. I saw a captive dolphin, the one in captivity, to see one up close. That's what it took. And then the last project that I worked on in China was an exhibit in a museum in Beijing, Natural Museum of History. And I really could see the process of how we move from, you know, animals being alive in their natural environment to seeing them in a captive situation, and in the end, the museum.
With 50 million people expected to move to the Pacific Northwest by the century's end, salmon advocates are scrambling to figure out how to keep the Columbia's wild salmon from suffering the same fate as the Baiji.
Down here, look at these.
So on the wall behind me you can see these petroglyphs, actual figures and drawings that are scratched into the rock. One of the most difficult things about having a Columbia River be a managed river now, having the dams, is that so many sites like this have been flooded and put underwater. And these sites are traditional significance to the indigenous peoples of this area. And in many cases, they can't even get to these sites anymore because they're beneath the backwaters of a dam. One of the reasons we can see this one is that the John Day Dam is about 200 yards upstream that way. So we're something close to run of the river here. And now I can start seeing petroglyphs and things like this again.
The petroglyphs were a bunch of headstones, you know, from memories that we carry. We knew where they were located. We could see them from where we fished at. My dad fished in this channel, and you could see them over there. There was a cable car that went out to Albert Island, and right below that cable car you could see these petroglyphs out there all the time. You could go on the islands, and you could see them there. So there was plenty of them there that undisturbed.
The petroglyphs are pretty much in locations in the area where they were before, but much stripped down. They're parts of museums, or decorations outside museums, and so on. They're way up building monuments way up above the water where they weren't, when they were, in order to be knocked off the cliffs and dragged up and so on like that. They are all pretty much in sort of run-down condition, and it's just a few more years in large measure, 10, 20, 30, something like that, and even these monuments, I imagine, will have fallen apart.
Most of the petroglyphs and pictographs along the Columbia River are inundated. The dams of the Columbia River, Wampum Dam, for example, there were like 31 different sites that were inundated. Different sections of the river had different assortments of pictographs and petroglyphs. The ones at Rock Island are now submerged or destroyed during the dam building process. So anywhere from 20 to 40 feet underwater, in most cases, at least up in this area.
And all of these petroglyphs, the big rocks, are being all scarred up today. There isn't any care for something that came from the burial grounds, we call them, from the original Columbia River. They should have left them intact and, undisturbed.
And it's interesting, a lot of people feel like, oh, that's too bad that those sacred images are underwater. I and a lot of Native American people feel differently. It's as though that they're actually more protected. Pictographs and petroglyphs aren't necessarily meant to be seen. They're places that are sacred, holy places where one makes connection with an alternative world that offers both possibility as well as even danger. So that they are underwater means they're not going to be vandalized. Hunters aren't going to use them as target practice, which has happened. It's like they're protected, and that's a good thing.
In the film version of Ken Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Chief Bromden has been committed to the mental hospital because of alcoholism. In the book, Chief has been committed because of trauma he experienced after the flooding of Celilo Falls.
There are these faults in the riverbed where the whole Columbia River used to crash over the falls, and of course the fish would gather at the lower part until they could leap those ledges, and that's where the Indians dip net with the big long pole nets with hoops on the end to dip them as the salmon would make their leap or prepare for the leap.
I fished there when I was 16, and it was just a wonderful place to be. The roar of the river, the roar of the falls. When you left there and came home, you couldn't sleep for a couple of nights because it's too quiet.
When you pulled in there, you could see all of the camps. And it was a time of gathering. All of the people come together to come together and visit.
Celilo was known as a trading center from time immemorial. And it would be like a huge county fair. All summer long there would be people bringing venison, roots, all kinds of things from the east and the west and the south. And then they would also do some trading with the coast Indians who would ride canoes up to Celilo. So it was a trading center long before any white man came here.
There was always an abundance of fish. You know, like I was saying that this man catching a ton and a half. Well, we caught a ton and a half today, but they worked for it. They worked for it, and these weren't the hatchery fish that we're talking about today. And I've seen them at times pull 2 at a time out of there, probably 30, 40, 50 pounds.
Those fearless people go out there and build these scaffolds and build them to where they were confident it would hold them when sometimes they catch 2, 3 fish at a time. It was just phenomenal.
I enjoyed it. You know, it was like a sport almost. It seemed like you never got tired of catching them.
And one day I was there and could hear a flop, flop, flop on the Suford's cable platform there. And here come Jay Minthorn coming down there. He had a salmon that was at least big as him, or maybe bigger. He had the gills right here over his head, and still the tail was dragging so much on the ground, and he'd go.
This was an everyday occurrence, that there was plenty of those fish at that weight and caught every day. And when I was growing up, to hear my dad and others tell me when they were a boy that you could walk on the backs of these salmon from one side of the river to the other, I kind of doubted that at that time. So I can understand what this generation is also thinking when I talk to them about this.
And you could go right down by the platforms, right down into the area and watch and actually get the flavor of fishing.
I just enjoyed the Indians just about as much as I did taking the pictures, because I knew what was going to happen and I knew I was going to miss it.
Things were so common, and we just thought they were going to continue.
That's a hard day to speak about, because all of us were there was hurt in our way. And there was a lot of anger that happened that day as they were mourning the loss of the unique Celilo Falls, a way of life, a traditional way of living that was there for centuries.
Celilo was covered over in the name of progress, could not stop progress.
So right now I'm treading water above what used to be Celilo Falls, which is now buried behind the backwaters of the Dalles Dam. Celilo was more than a waterfall. It was a gathering place for 14 indigenous bands that got together every time there was a fish run. And when we flooded Celilo Falls, one of the things that happened is that the beating heart of that culture, those 14 cultures, I should say, went underwater. One of the diciest issues on the river is what to do when you've harmed someone or their culture because of what progress is brought to the river. And in particular, when you're dealing with the dams, these issues are all tied up in the American myth, in what we describe as progress. So here at Celilo, we have the single biggest example of social injustice that happened as we brought progress to the river. What I think needs to happen now is that we need to start concentrating our energies around how to make it right.
It's a place, I think, that if we could rediscover it, that is, in some way breach the Dalles Dam, I think it would be not just the right thing to do, but also a good thing to do economically. That dam has nothing to do with flood control. The Dalles just works with the water that comes passing through. It doesn't store water like the big storage dams do. The aluminum industry, that's one big reason for the Dalles Dam. That industry is leaving the country. Our aluminum is going to come from overseas. The only big economic consideration, and it is a huge one, is that if you do away with one dam, the Dalles Dam, then you've lost the commercial traffic between the inland empire, the grain-growing country, the Palouse, and these ports down here at Vancouver and Portland. I think it would be in our long-term interests as humans who live here to see that place as it was again. I also think it would fit what I think of as the Oregonness of our place. Some grand gesture that's different from the way people act in Omaha or other places. Say we are tied to this place, and Celilo Falls is central, is core to this place, and we're going to bring it back.
Maybe the best argument for doing something about Celilo is the kids. There's still people around who remember Celilo Falls as a falls. But now, I have trouble, and elders have trouble convincing their kids it existed at all. If we want our river back, if we want the falls back, we need to see what happens when we let the river be a river. I think the only way we can do that is draw down this fake lake and reveal those falls again. Celilo's down there, but I think she's invisible now.
Last thing you hear is like thump against your head, and then you're under it. And then you back up, you're like, all right, start again. Move the arms. Seems like a little fun. Fun? Fun for like 20 minutes. Thank you.
Christopher was greeted in Portland by members of the Surfrider Foundation. The Surfriders monitor pollution levels in surfing locations. Because the Columbia empties into the Pacific Ocean, they saw it fit to support Christopher's effort.
All water begins and ends in the ocean, and every drop of rainfall that falls in the Columbia Basin ends in our Pacific Ocean. The first review of national ocean policy in 30 years looked at ocean management and tied it immediately to coastal development and upland water quality. We all have a stake not only in the river, but in all water, which begins and ends in the ocean.
Everything from arsenic to zinc is in the water by the time we get to Portland. And then we've got some special additives once we get here. And when you flush your toilet in Portland at the end of January, it's been raining for 2 or 3 months, most of that ends up in the Willamette or the Columbia because our systems aren't separated yet. We don't separate our stormwater from our sewage water yet in all the pipes in Portland. So you have the distinction if you're a swimmer doing a training swim in the winter of getting to do your last bathroom break at your house before you go to Kelly Point Park and actually swimming through your own waste a couple of hours later when you're training. One of my hopes, all humor aside, is that Portland will lead the way of communities on the river separating those systems.
Let's not forget
this is your river, and it reflects who you are.
The spirit grows, tradition knows how we've misunderstood. The money's spoken for too long. We've got to kill the beast. Follow our hearts, not fall apart. And that's
everything that happens upstream comes on down to us.
Create a way, don't look away, don't look away. Create a way, don't look away, don't look away. Create a way, don't look away, don't look away. Create a way, don't look away, don't look away.
What kind of people are we?
Don't look away. Create a way, don't look away. Create a way.
40 miles downriver of Portland, Christopher swam past the Trojan nuclear power plant. Like Hanford, Trojan's radioactive and chemical waste remain in cooling tanks along the river. After Trojan, Christopher swam past what he called the final insult to the river, the pulp mills of Longview, Washington. These pulp mills discharge dioxins and furans into the Columbia, which break down immune and organ systems in humans and fish. New technologies are available that can nearly eliminate the toxic discharge from these mills. The lower Columbia was once home to one of the largest fisheries the world has ever known. Northern Europeans arrived in this area with a pre-existing taste for salmon, and canneries boomed. But in just a few decades, the 16 million strong salmon run on the Columbia was obliterated, and the canneries shut down.
We have managed to bring the greatest salmon-producing watershed in the world to its knees. There's a lot of salmon out there, but most of them are hatchery fish. They're not going to be the basis of biodiversity. They're not going to be what we take our children to see in the future. If you just look at the numbers, you think, geez, where's the salmon problem? You have to look at the wild fish and the distribution of the wild fish and the fact that over a third of the basin isn't even accessible anymore to salmon. And yet we march on, each generation a compromise. Every environmental win is temporary and every environmental loss is permanent as we ratchet ourselves into the dirt. Forever more electricity, forever more special interest politics and economics. If these fish were in any worse trouble, we wouldn't be able to save them. I work with those people who work on Atlantic salmon in Maine, and they're desperate, and they're losing it because the fish are too far gone. They'll end up taking their children to the museums to see the pictures because it's over for them. It's not over for us. We won't get back the Columbia of Lewis and Clark, and we shouldn't even try. We should try to be realistic about how to strike a balance over a long period of time between our civilization and wild salmon. In the history of the world, nobody has ever struck that balance. When our civilization meets wild salmon lose, they're the aquatic grizzly bear. They're out of here. It's just a matter of time. The dominoes fall as we march toward Alaska and Kamchatka. We have a chance in our period of time right now to make that difference. That's our challenge.
Even when I was growing up, I made no connection between what was happening in the woods and what happens to salmon. That's a new idea, okay, that logging is connected to the health of the fishery. Growing up in Estacada, you'd think a reasonably bright kid, that would have occurred to him by the time he gets through high school. And it didn't. That idea was not around. We didn't appreciate the connectedness of things.
At this point, Che Wana is a contaminated beauty. Her toxic load includes pollutants from as far away as Hanford and British Columbia. Sometimes it is difficult to remember that there is a wild river beneath the backwaters of the dams. If we wish to preserve what remains of the wild Columbia, and maybe even get back some of what was lost, some difficult questions will need to be answered. How can we manage the hydro system of the Columbia Basin so that wild salmon will not go extinct? Does it make economic sense to remove the Dalles Dam and reveal Celilo Falls? The conservative think tank, the Rand Corporation, concluded that it would make economic sense to remove the dams on the Snake River. No such study has been done for the Dalles Dam and Celilo Falls. With millions of people expected to move to the Pacific Northwest over the next several decades, how can we lessen the pressures this will bring to what remains of the wild Columbia? While there are no easy answers and no quick fixes to many of Che Wana's problems, as Christopher likes to say, if we can put a man on the moon, we can have clean, drinkable water in our rivers and keep salmon from going extinct. Christopher has a 10-year plan to swim waterways and outreach to communities across the globe in his effort to bring water quality issues into the public eye. He can be reached at his website, swimforcleanwater.org. One of the easiest ways to start caring for your local waterway is simply to go to it and start pulling out the trash.
This is a famed Deer Creek garbage pile. Most of it, all of it either out of the creek or right off the banks. Just ended up with this big pile. You got 55-gallon drums, got plenty of barbed wire. You just got just nasty stuff. You don't even know what it is.
I grew up in Milwaukee, and we often traveled along 82nd Avenue, crossing over that one overpass there. Had no idea this was down here. None. It was amazing to be out here and to see that it's wilderness in the midst of industrial chaos. It's good stuff.
Yeah, the project is a pretty good cooperation between the county, Clackamas County, Friends of Trees, the Friends of Mount Scott and Kellogg Creek. Those guys are on our crew. North Clackamas Parks is getting involved with it. Precision Cast Parts, a manufacturing plant. McFarland's Bark lets us park in their parking lot. It's just a whole lot of people that are, into the restoration project and want to see good things done. So we're all here together.
In eastern Oregon, this type of grassroots effort led to one of the greatest river restoration success stories in the Columbia Basin, a joint volunteer effort between area ranchers, farmers, and tribal members led to the successful return of the Umatilla River Salmon Run. Immediately upon the salmon's return, alcoholism and suicide rates among teenage Umatilla tribal members began to drop. The beating heart of Umatilla culture had returned.
The whole idea of creating a balance now to live here comfortably, sustainably, it's a new idea, and more people are getting it. Little kids now, 5th grade, they go out and watch the salmon spawn. Their teachers understand the connectedness of things. I see a new generation coming up where they just understand better that the river is not just for us.
Christopher would be finished swimming the mighty Columbia River once he reached statutory mile 0, marked by buoy G7, a half-mile into the Pacific Ocean. Once finished, Christopher would be the first human to swim all 1,243 miles of the river. Only the salmon have outdone Christopher in this mammoth achievement. Untold millions have swum the length of the river in both directions.
The last day there's boats and helicopters and cruise ships and people and waves, and it was classic Columbia Bar day. Fortunately, the tide was going out fast. Pretty much as soon as Swain jumped in the water, we could see that we were headed toward the last buoy. It was a long, long swim. It was 13 months, a lot of joy and excitement, a lot of pain. And it was something that had never been done before.
Yeah, I wanted to put the river in the public eye, and I did. And I wanted to start a discussion, provoke a discussion, and I certainly have in the towns and the communities along the way. Has it been easy? No. You know, it's not just getting hit by Douglas fir trees hidden inside 6-foot stormways and swimming through people's shit and getting run over by boats and all that stuff. It's that I'm a dad, I'm a husband, I want to be home. You know, it's one of the saddest things in my entire life is like missing Heather and Roe during this time. And it's been hard because I've had to really look into my heart and say, like, why do it then? Why keep going? And I think the answer is it's like bigger than me, and it's bigger than the family, and it doesn't last forever. I mean, what's on the line here is who we are in the Northwest. Now that we know that the river needs help, now that we know that the river's contaminated, now that we know that we accidentally harmed cultures and ways of life and people along the way as progress had its way with the river, my question becomes, first for me and then for all of us, what am I willing to do? What are we willing to do?
In between our breaths, we walk with the dead, carrying our visions against sunset after sunset. Always a moment too soon to realize. It's always a moment to regret. I'm falling through the footsteps of the past, falling under the weight of the future. 'Cause sometimes I can only react, and sometimes I'm just an actor. Yeah, hey, yeah, hey. Yeah, hey, yeah, hey, ha. All these images haunt me, like a life I'm trying to leave behind me. A ghost locked inside your shadow, an echo reaching into tomorrow. Where are our dreams of beauty? Interrupted prayers behind closed doors, sheltered by your reality. What is a future if it's made from wars? Yeah, hey, yeah, hey. Yeah, hey, yeah, hey, ha. How can you live your life on your knees when you know the truth that'll set you free? How can we live our lives on our knees when we know the truth that'll set us free? Yeah, hey, yeah, hey. Yeah, hey, yeah, hey, ha. Reaching ends that are beginnings. Awake, or am I dreaming? Cross the line, sever the side. Are we broken? So shattered not to feel? Or are we just paying for what we steal? Making the dream. Ya hey, ya hey. Ya hey, ya hey, ha. Ya hey, ya hey. Ya hey, ya hey, ha. How can we build trust that will last when lie upon lie are burying the past? It's always a question too often ignored. What is the future if it's made from wars?
It means a lot to me. It's something I was taught since I was a little kid. And I used to be inside dancing as a little boy and grew up and made to be a fisherman, taught to fish and to hunt, and we gather wood. And through the years, the grandparents put me in charge and to run the feast and work with the woman here. And we all have a role. We all work together as a family, as a community along the river.
There will be a time when the river is restored. These dams are only limestone. They will go away eventually. And there's a story that we talk about that is from legendary times about how Coyote broke the dams. And it talks about how the greedy ones, these Sparrow sisters, came and they built this dam across the river and they blocked all the salmon from going up to feed all the animal people. And so Coyote came down and in his creativity figured a way to break the dam, to divert the attention of the greedy ones. And indeed he did that, and he saved a salmon. Well, that legend exists today, and it's creativity that we follow Coyote. We believe that there will be a time when maybe not just the tribes as Coyote, but a lot of people in different faces as Coyote will come forward. That's our hope, and we believe in our legends. We believe in the history that we live. So it's only a matter of time.
You don't need to be a scientist to know that a concrete dam is a barrier to fish passage, that pumping a bunch of fish into a cargo bin on a barge and zooming them downstream and dumping them further down is going to confuse and stress out fish. You don't have to be a genius to know if you put somebody's church underwater, their place of worship, their traditional lands, that they're going to be hurt by that. But somehow we've sold ourselves a story that lets us think that those things are okay. And that story paints a picture of us as a people that commits injustices and damages the environment and makes mistakes that we don't appear to want to recover from. So I'm out to promote a different story and advocate for a different way we can take things, and I hope I can hook some people. I hope people buy it.
So we can sing one more together, okay? Is that all right with you? This one's for the fish. This is your part. I'm a wild Chinook salmon, ain't no hatchery child. People, I'm a wild Chinook salmon, ain't no hatchery child. And when you dam up my river, you cramp my style. I'm a wild Chinook salmon, ain't no hatchery child. Same line again. I'm a wild Chinook salmon, ain't no hatchery child. And when you dam up my river, you cramp my style. You got it. So when it comes around, you know exactly what to do. When you clear cut the forest, it's like pouring dirt into the middle of my home. Yeah, people, when you clear cut the forest, it's like pouring dirt into the middle of my home. And when you muddy up my bedroom, I ain't got nowhere to spawn. No, 'cause I'm a wild Chinook salmon, ain't no hatchery child. I'm a wild Chinook salmon, ain't no hatchery child. And when you dam up my river, you cramp my style. Now I might swim 1,000 miles just to reach the sea. I can swim over 1,000 miles just to reach the sea. And then I'll up and turn around one day when that urge takes hold of me. 'Cause I'm a wild Chinook salmon, ain't no hatchery child. I'm a wild Chinook salmon, ain't no hatchery child. And when you dam up my river, you cramp my style. All right, just repeat after me. La la la, la la la.